I was 18 and had just finished my matriculation exams when my mother, Claire, decided to marry Daniel. It was one of the most exciting and complicated times of my life. At first, their wedding didn't affect me much. To be honest, I just wanted my mother to be happy. Daniel seemed like a nice guy, polite and understanding, but his son Ethan was a different story. Ethan was only 15 at the time, a bit of a child, a bit shy and a bit rebellious, but definitely a sweet teenager. I didn't spend much time with him because I was busy preparing for university, and when we lived together, he mostly stayed in his room. I always thought of him as Daniel's son, just a part of my life. After university started, I moved to another city and started a whole new life. During the 4 years I was gone, I thought everyone would have changed, including Ethan, but I never imagined it would affect me when I came home. I was 22 years old at the time, and felt like I had grown up, with a degree and big dreams. But no matter how much I thought I had grown up, I realized that I was not ready for what was about to happen, because Ethan was no longer the shy, childish boy. He was 19 years old, completely transformed into a different person, taller and more confident, and the look in his eyes made me feel inexplicably uneasy. I will never forget the moment I realized this. It was one evening, just me and him at home. Mom and Daniel had gone out. I was in the kitchen, snacking, when Ethan walked past, reaching into a cupboard. It was a perfectly normal movement, but why did my breathing become rapid? But at that moment I felt him notice me, and he asked, "Olivia, are you okay?" His voice was unusually gentle. I was so shocked I couldn't answer. I just nodded and left the kitchen. At that moment, everything started to change. I kept reminding myself that he was still just my stepbrother, but my mind was deceiving me. I don't know how to explain it, but I have to admit that whatever Ethan was, he was no longer just Daniel's son, and realizing that was the biggest crisis of my life. We were supposed to go to Marcus's villa, a friend of my dad's. How was I supposed to know what was going to happen there? If you want to be the first to know these fascinating secrets, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, and watch the video to the end, because it gets really weird. That evening, the 4 of us sat around the table, my mother, Claire, Daniel, Ethan, and I. The conversation was as usual, ordinary. My mother was telling about her day, Daniel was sharing some details from work. Ethan ate quietly, occasionally looking up to listen to our conversation. Towards the end of dinner, Daniel suddenly became cheerful. "Do you remember Marcus's villa?" he asked. Daniel was Marcus's childhood friend. I had met him a few times. He was quite impressive but a bit pompous. My mother asked which villa it was. She put down her spoon. Daniel said his face was glowing with excitement. "The one by the pool with the sea view." Marcus said he was free this week and we should go there for a week, all of us. My mother's face immediately lit up. "Really, Daniel, that sounds fantastic. I need a holiday like that so badly." Daniel nodded, adding, "We all do. Olivia, you've just graduated, it would do you good, you could relax." My mother immediately turned to Ethan and said that the holiday would be good for you too, to clear your mind before starting a new life. Ethan glanced at my mother and shrugged, as if he were mumbling something. I froze at the table, inwardly admitting that the idea was exciting, but at the same time I was also a little uneasy, because I was going to spend a whole week with Ethan at Marcus's famous villa. I felt confused about spending a whole week at the famous villa. I glanced across the table at him, trying not to let him see that I'd noticed his gaze resting on his plate, but there was something hidden in his expression, as if he really wanted to spend the holiday, which made me even more uneasy. 2 days later, we arrived at the place that was to completely change my life over the next week. Marcus was even more impressive than I'd imagined. The villa had huge windows with a view of the sea, the large swimming pool and the garden was sparkling, and everything looked perfect. "This place is incredible." Mum is in awe. Daniel is unloading the luggage from the car and tells us to go and settle in our rooms. CLA and I will be staying in the main bedroom downstairs. He says, "You kids will be upstairs, and you have 2 rooms next to each other." Ethan grabs his bag and heads upstairs. I follow him, my heart racing. They really are next to each other, one for Ethan and one for me. Ethan opened the door, threw his suitcase into the room, then turned around and gave me a quick glance. There seemed to be something he wanted to say in his eyes, but he held back. I walked into my room, closed the door and took a deep breath. We were going to be here for a whole week, with Mom and Daniel downstairs and Ethan and me living upstairs. I had no idea how this holiday would change my life. Everyone was exhausted from the long journey that day. Mom and Daniel went back to their room and quickly fell asleep. Ethan quietly went back to his room, leaving me alone in my room, lost in thought. Despite the fact that my room was large and comfortable, the air was suffocating. I took a deep breath and sat by the window. The view from the window was stunning, the lights around the pool reflecting on the water, the breeze blowing and the palm trees swaying. I couldn't help but go downstairs, get a beer from the kitchen, sit on the lounger in front of the pool, open the beer, and let my thoughts wander. Ethan returned to the room acting as if nothing had happened, but I was still shaken by the silent exchange of glances we had at the table. I was angry with myself. I shouldn't let things like this get to me. That's when I noticed movement in the kitchen. The light was on. Ethan was stumbling around pouring water. I jumped up from the deck chair, went back into the room, trying not to let him see me. I closed the door behind me, making sure to tread as quietly as possible. My heart was pounding. I got under the covers, but couldn't sleep, just as I tried to put off what was going to happen the next afternoon. Before sunset, my mother and Daniel went to the pool. They were joking and having fun while swimming. Daniel sat on the deck chair and watched my mother in the water, shouting, "Come on, we'll be going inside for dinner soon, you guys, you'll have time too." Ethan and I looked at each other without saying a word, then got up, put on our swimsuits and walked towards the pool. The sun began to set, and the last rays of light spilled onto the water. Mom and Daniel came out of the pool and walked into the villa. When we entered the pool, everything became quiet. At first we kept some distance between us. The water was cold but relaxing. Ethan combed his hair with his hands in the corner. I caught a glimpse of him. He had a great body, had already shed his boyishness and exuded a confident air. I can feel his gaze on me, and as his eyes travel down to my bikini top and legs, an inexplicable flutter wells up inside me, rather than a sense of unease. I strangely like the feeling. "You look so serious," he says suddenly, smiling, and I'm quiet too. I suddenly appear out of nowhere, and he dives into the water and swims towards me. "Now I'm going to make you laugh," he says, and pulls me into his arms, lifting me up and throwing me into the pool without warning. I screamed as I fell in, then laughed again as I surfaced. "You wanted it," I shouted, and swam towards him. I grabbed the back of his neck and climbed onto his shoulders. Ethan held me, and we both laughed like children, but these small gestures pushed us towards something we couldn't stop. I could feel the warmth of his hands, the strength of his shoulders, and when our eyes met, everything seemed to freeze. The magic of that moment transcended the two bodies in the water. Ethan smiled at me, but there was something deeper behind the smile. We both seemed to know that this game was going to turn into something else. As we continued to play in the pool, we started to have more fun. Ethan kept making sudden movements, swimming around me, dipping me under, and every time our laughter intertwined, but every time we got closer, every splash, every laugh brought us closer together. Ethan suddenly pulled me under, and I was shocked when he submerged my head. I stood there in the water, clinging to his hand, but then he quickly pulled me back to the surface, and I gasped for air. My eyes locked on his as the water dripped off of us and the distance between us grew smaller. "You really want this," he said, and I shouted, "Yes," but my voice was almost drowned out, my heart was beating fast, and when my hands touched the surface of the water, it was different from wanting it. I suddenly added that we were standing face to face, our arms immersed in the water, only a few steps away from each other. At that moment, everything stopped, there was silence in the air, and we could only hear the sound of our own heartbeat. Our gazes locked, just inches apart, and the coldness of the water no longer mattered. My emotions were overwhelming, and in Ethan's eyes I saw the same confusion, the same nervousness. At that moment, we almost held our breath, feeling like we were drifting away from everything. Our bodies were so close, but no one touched the other. Everything was confined to this moment, and every second felt like a gentle touch would change everything. Ethan took another step closer, watching every movement of my body on the water. He whispered, and I held my breath. When we took another step forward, his arm dipped into the water. I looked into his eyes and felt something start to change deep inside me. We were close, and I knew that the next step we took would change everything. Ethan paused in the water for a moment and slowly reached out his hand. It was at that moment that his fingertips lightly brushed the surface of the water, his eyes locked with mine. My hand reached out to his without my realizing it. For a moment I hesitated, but I couldn't ignore the attraction of his touch, and when our hands finally met, my heart began to beat rapidly. I felt my whole body tremble. At that moment, everything came to a halt in our eyes. No further steps were needed, just being so close to each other was enough. At that moment, my heart beat faster, and the strong emotions inside me were hard to suppress. Ethan held my hand, squeezed it tighter, and slowly moved closer. For a brief moment, I couldn't help but want to let him know how I felt. Everything needed to get out of control. I looked into his eyes and let the chaos inside take over, and then unintentionally lightly kissed his lips. Time stopped for a moment, everything was compressed into an instant, our hearts beating faster, we could almost hear each other's heartbeat. I closed my eyes and lost myself in the moment. Everything changed in an instant. And just then we heard Daniel's voice, "Children, dinner is ready, come on." Suddenly everything returned to normal. The warmth of that moment seemed to evaporate and disappear. We couldn't look each other in the eye. We put these warm feelings aside and quietly started eating. We both knew how much we wanted it, but we chose to remain silent, focusing only on our food. During dinner, we didn't look at each other once, didn't say a word. It felt like everything had returned to normal, the magic of that moment had disappeared, but even in that silence, something had changed. I couldn't stand it anymore, somehow I needed to leave the room. I felt like there was too much pent-up emotion inside me, I needed to catch my breath. I quietly opened the door and walked out into the hall. My heart was still pounding. Meanwhile, Ethan's door opened. We stood there without looking at each other. Everything took on multiple meanings in that moment. We both felt the same way, but it seemed difficult to accept. We locked eyes. At that moment, there was nothing we could do but look at each other. At that moment, we had nothing to say, but we both knew what we were feeling inside. Without even a second's hesitation, our hands reached out to each other. Without words, the inner cry, everything disappeared. I took a step forward, we leaned close, our breaths mingled, Ethan's eyes never left mine. "I don't know what to do, Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling, but I knew what we both needed. I took another step forward, closer to him, following the unspoken agreement in our eyes. I took another step forward, suddenly realizing how much Ethan wanted this. I didn't hesitate as I walked towards him, and when our lips met, everything stopped. The world disappeared for a moment, leaving just the two of us. My heart began to race, my hands loosened, and I knew what was about to happen. Everything between us was erased. For a moment, I didn't even want to step back. The warmth and excitement of that moment was more than enough. Something inside me stirred when Ethan's hand wrapped around my waist. We walked slowly step by step towards my room, until Ethan finally led me to my room and the door closed behind us. We were together, Ethan lying next to me. I realized that everything felt so strange. Everything we had done, said, and touched still felt strange to me. My gaze rested on the ceiling, my body still tense. Lying next to me, Ethan made everything seem normal, but the chaos inside me would not subside for a long time. After a while, my gaze moved to his clothes. The shirt and shorts were in the corner of the room, just a step away from where I had left my bikini, lying in a messy pile. How had he found me? What had happened between us? My mind was full of questions. For the rest of the holiday, I felt I had to pretend everything was fine, but every second I spent with my family, especially with my mother and Daniel, felt heavy inside. What had happened between Ethan and me was intensifying with every passing moment. I hid it, it echoed inside me. I seized every opportunity to avoid them, to stay as far away from them as possible. I couldn't stand being with them for more than 5 minutes. I started to feel awkward around them. I don't want anyone but Ethan, but no matter how close I get to him, it's impossible to explain my feelings and express them. How can I explain all this to my family? I'm still Olivia, 22 years old, but I'm still treated like a child, but after everything I've been through with Ethan, I feel everything differently. Ethan understands me very well, but at the same time, he's also very confused. There's a huge gap between what he says and what he seems to feel. He seems calm, but deep down he knows something is wrong. Our tacit understanding is like hope, hoping that everything will stay the same, but no matter how hard I resist, everything is moving in a different direction. Throughout the holiday, we didn't become closer, we talked, we smiled, but it felt like there was a barrier, a huge barrier, that cannot be described in words. Except for the brief moments with Ethan, everything else became bland and unremarkable, but whenever I think about those seconds of contact, and the moment our eyes met, my emotions would surge like an avalanche. But I didn't know what had happened or what to do next. I still can't forget that night or what happened after. I didn't know what to do or how to move on. I'd never been so close to my family. I had to keep all my feelings, worries, and fears about Ethan inside, but no one could understand the cries inside me. I told no one, maybe they were just waiting for the right moment to give me an answer. All of this took me to another place. When I close my eyes, there is only one thing in the darkness, and that is the future. But what will that future look like? Will Ethan and I grow closer, or will everything fade away? If you have read this far, I know that my story has already affected you. There is so much to share that you won't want to miss a thing. Please make sure you click the follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment on this story. I would love to know what you think, so let's chat in the comments. Your support means a lot to me.